You embarrass me, Elijah. Vanessa Carter's voice cut through the entire village square like a knife. The music stopped instantly. Dozens of people turned toward Elijah Brooks standing beside the wooden stage with a small velvet ring box trembling in his rough hands. Laughter exploded around him before he could even speak again. You really thought I would marry a man who cannot even fix his own roof? Vanessa stepped backward in her elegant white dress while rich guests smirked behind her. Expensive trucks lined the festival entrance. Gold lights hung across the square. Everyone looked polished. Everyone except Elijah. His faded denim jacket was damp from the evening rain. Dust covered his old boots. The tiny ring in his hand suddenly looked cheap beneath the glowing festival lights. Elijah swallowed hard. Vanessa. I was only trying. Harold Carter interrupted sharply from the front row. The wealthy village chairman slowly stood beside his bodyguards. A poor man with empty pockets should stop dreaming so loudly. More laughter followed. Phones lifted into the air. Some teenagers started recording him openly now. Elijah's face burned with humiliation. He looked toward Vanessa one more time, desperate for even a little mercy. I loved you, he whispered. Vanessa folded her arms coldly. Love does not pay bills. The crowd erupted again. Someone shouted, tell him to go back to his broken shack. Another voice laughed, maybe he can marry his old pickup truck instead. Elijah lowered his eyes. The tiny ring box slowly slipped closed in his shaking hand. Around him stood polished shoes, expensive jewelry, silk dresses, luxury watches. Behind him waited darkness, unpaid bills, and the tiny collapsing house where Ruth Brooks struggled to breathe every night without proper medicine. He was not begging for himself anymore. He was begging for the last piece of dignity he still had left. Please, Elijah said quietly. Do not do this in front of everyone. Vanessa's expression hardened even more. Then you should not have embarrassed yourself in front of everyone. Harold stepped closer now. You hear that? The girl already answered you. He pointed toward the exit of the square. Leave before security throws you out. Two large men immediately started walking toward Elijah. The crowd parted while whispers spread like poison. Poor fool. He actually believed she wanted him. Look at his clothes. Elijah backed away slowly. His chest tightened. But then an older woman near the food stand suddenly spoke softly. Maybe the boy really loves her. Tiny hope. Tiny mercy. But Vanessa crushed it instantly. Love from a poor man becomes burden, she snapped. I refuse to waste my life suffering beside someone with nothing. Silence hit Elijah harder than the insults. Even the woman who defended him lowered her eyes afterward. Nobody else spoke for him. Nobody. Elijah clenched the old silver pocket watch hanging from a chain beneath his shirt. His father's watch. The only thing he had left from the man he barely remembered. Harold noticed it for one strange second. His confident smile flickered slightly. Tiny. Almost invisible. But real. Elijah saw it. Then it disappeared. Get him out, Harold ordered coldly. The bodyguards grabbed Elijah's shoulders roughly and pushed him down the festival steps while phones followed him everywhere. The small velvet ring box fell into the mud. Nobody helped him pick it up. Vanessa turned away before he could even stand again. The entire village watched him like he was less than human. Elijah slowly bent down into the mud, picked up the ring box with trembling fingers, and wiped rainwater from his face without letting himself cry. Behind him, music started again. Laughter returned. His humiliation became entertainment. Then suddenly, every sound in the square began fading beneath the low growl of engines approaching from the dark road outside the village. Headlights flooded the street. A long black luxury SUV stopped directly beside Elijah. The crowd fell silent again. One sharply dressed man stepped out holding an umbrella. He looked directly at Elijah's muddy pocket watch and froze completely. Then he whispered 3 words that made Harold Carter's face lose all color. "Mr. Brooks, finally." The entire village square fell silent after the stranger stepped out of the black SUV and called him Mr. Brooks. Rain still dripped from Elijah's faded jacket while mud clung to his boots. Across from him stood polished shoes, luxury coats, gold jewelry, and the woman who had just shattered his heart in front of everyone. Elijah tightened his grip around the old silver pocket watch beneath his shirt. "You have the wrong person," he said quietly. The man with the umbrella stared at the watch again instead of answering. His expensive charcoal suit looked untouched by rain. Calm. Sharp. Powerful. "My name is Malcolm Reed," he finally said. "I have been searching for that watch for a very long time." Murmurs spread instantly through the crowd. Harold Carter's jaw tightened. Vanessa folded her arms again, trying to hide the sudden nervousness in her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she snapped loudly. "He is just a broke mechanic." Malcolm looked directly at her. "Is he?" Silence hit the square again. Elijah lowered his eyes. Humiliation still burned inside him. He could still hear the laughter from minutes earlier echoing through his chest. "I do not want trouble," Elijah whispered. "I just want to go home." Malcolm noticed the shaking in Elijah's hands immediately. Not weakness. Exhaustion. Years of it. Then a cold wind pushed rain across the square again. Elijah coughed hard into his sleeve. His stomach had been empty since morning. Back home, Ruth Brooks was alone in the collapsing house waiting for medicine he still could not afford. Meanwhile, rich guests continued sipping wine beneath glowing festival lights. Expensive trucks lined the streets. Vanessa stood protected beneath heated tents while Elijah stood soaked and humiliated in mud. 2 different worlds. 1 village. Harold stepped forward aggressively. "Whoever you are," he told Malcolm, "this man has no business here anymore." Malcolm remained calm. "Interesting." He slowly looked around the village square. "Because according to old records, the Brooks family once owned most of this land." A ripple moved through the crowd instantly. Vanessa laughed nervously. "Everybody knows that family disappeared years ago." Malcolm's eyes returned to Elijah. "Not everybody." Tiny hope flickered for the first time all night. "Small. Fragile. Dangerous." Elijah shook his head immediately. "My father died when I was young. We never owned anything." Malcolm's expression changed slightly after hearing that. "What was his name?" Before Elijah could answer, Harold interrupted sharply. "Enough." His voice came too fast. Too loud. Suspiciously loud. "You are filling this poor boy's head with fantasies." The crowd quickly followed Harold's lead again. "Exactly. Rich people play games. Poor Elijah is getting used again." Vanessa stepped closer to Elijah now, lowering her voice cruelly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Do not embarrass yourself twice in one night." Elijah swallowed painfully. Even now, even after destroying him publicly, she still looked at him with shame instead of regret. Then a tiny voice suddenly spoke from near the food stand. "Mama says Mr. Elijah fixed our roof for free." A little girl stood clutching her mother's hand while staring innocently toward the crowd. "He helps everybody." Silence spread awkwardly again. Elijah looked down immediately, embarrassed. Tiny hope. Tiny dignity. But Harold crushed it instantly. "Helping people does not make him important," he snapped. The child's mother quickly pulled her away. Nobody dared challenge Harold openly. "If you are listening right now, tell me where you are watching from. And tell me honestly, do you believe Elijah is hiding something, or do you think this village is destroying an innocent man?" Malcolm slowly opened a leather folder beside the SUV. Elijah noticed old photographs inside for one brief second. One picture showed a man standing beside a younger Harold Carter many years ago. The man looked strangely familiar. Elijah's breathing slowed. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. Malcolm did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at the silver watch chain hanging from Elijah's neck. "May I see it?" Elijah hesitated. That watch was the last thing connecting him to his dead father. Ruth protected it for years like it carried something sacred. Harold noticed Elijah reaching for it and suddenly stepped forward too quickly. "No," the word escaped his mouth before he could stop it. The entire square noticed. Malcolm noticed most of all. A strange silence swallowed the village again. Harold's confident expression flickered for one dangerous second. Fear. Real fear. Then suddenly Elijah's cracked phone began vibrating violently inside his pocket. He answered immediately. Ruth Brooks's weak voice trembled through the speaker. "Elijah," she coughed painfully. "Some men came here asking about your father's name." Elijah froze. Malcolm's eyes sharpened instantly. Harold Carter turned pale beneath the festival lights. Then Malcolm closed his folder slowly and spoke in a calm voice that changed the air around everyone. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly. "You need to come with me. Tonight. Mr. Brooks, you need to come with me. Tonight." Malcolm Reed's calm voice hung in the rain-soaked village square while everyone stared at Elijah like the world had suddenly changed around him. Elijah tightened his grip around the cracked phone near his chest. Ruth's weak coughing still echoed through the speaker. "I cannot leave my mother alone," he whispered immediately. Malcolm's eyes softened for the first time. "Your mother is Ruth Brooks?" Elijah nodded slowly. Something moved across Malcolm's face then. Recognition. Shock. Fear. Harold Carter noticed it too. "This conversation is over," Harold snapped sharply. "Take your rich games somewhere else." Malcolm ignored him completely. Instead, he handed Elijah a clean business card with a silver emblem pressed into the corner. Brooks Holdings Group. Elijah stared at the name silently. He had never touched paper that expensive in his life. Meanwhile, rainwater dripped from his old sleeves onto muddy ground beside luxury shoes and polished black cars. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. "Elijah," she said coldly, "do not embarrass yourself chasing fantasies." Elijah looked at her one last time. The woman he once planned to spend his life with now looked ashamed even standing near him. "I never asked for any of this," he said quietly. Vanessa looked away first. Malcolm opened the SUV door carefully. Warm leather seats glowed beneath soft interior lighting. A completely different world from the leaking shack waiting for Elijah across town. But Elijah did not enter immediately. "I need to check on Ruth." Malcolm nodded once. "Then we go together." The drive across the village revealed everything Elijah tried to survive every day. Broken fences. Empty stores. Dark roads. The farther they traveled from the festival lights, the poorer the world became. Finally the SUV stopped beside a tiny collapsing house leaning slightly beneath years of storms and neglect. One weak kitchen light flickered inside. Elijah stepped out quickly and ran through the rain. Malcolm remained near the vehicle silently watching the house. Elijah opened the front door carefully. Ruth Brooks sat wrapped in blankets beside the kitchen table coughing into an old towel stained by years of medicine and sickness. Unpaid bills covered the table beside empty prescription bottles. The heater barely worked. "Mama," Elijah breathed softly. Ruth looked up weakly and forced a tired smile. "You came home." Elijah knelt beside her immediately. "Who came here asking about my father?" Ruth's hands trembled slightly. "I did not open the door." Malcolm slowly entered the house behind him. Expensive shoes touching cracked wooden floors. Ruth froze the second she saw him. Her breathing stopped for one terrifying moment. "No," she whispered weakly. "Not again." Elijah looked between them in confusion. Malcolm removed his glasses slowly. "Mrs. Brooks," he said carefully, "where did Elijah get that pocket watch?" Silence swallowed the tiny house. Rain hit the roof harder outside. Elijah looked down at the silver watch resting in his hand. The old engraving suddenly felt heavier than before. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. His father left it the night he disappeared. Malcolm stared at Elijah instantly. "Disappeared?" Elijah frowned. "I thought he died." Ruth lowered her head painfully. "That is what they wanted us to believe." Emotional silence crashed through the room. Tiny hope. Tiny terror. Elijah slowly sat beside the table while Malcolm quietly examined old family photographs hanging crookedly on the wall. One photograph stopped him cold. A younger man stood beside Ruth holding baby Elijah outside a large estate house. Harold Carter stood in the background smiling beside them. Malcolm's expression darkened instantly. "This photo," he whispered. Elijah looked confused. "What about it?" Before Malcolm could answer, loud banging suddenly exploded against the front door. Ruth jumped violently in fear. Elijah stood immediately. A harsh voice shouted from outside. "Rent is overdue again, Elijah." The landlord. More pressure. More humiliation. Elijah closed his eyes for one exhausted second. "Please," he whispered toward the door. "Give me 2 more days." "No more promises," the landlord yelled back. "Tomorrow morning this place gets locked." Ruth began coughing harder again. Elijah looked completely trapped now. Poor. Powerless. Drowning. Then Malcolm quietly reached into his coat and placed an old yellow document onto the table beside the unpaid bills. Elijah stared at it. His own last name sat printed across the top. Brooks family land ownership record. But the bottom half of the document had been violently torn away. Ruth's face lost all color instantly. Then she whispered one sentence that made Malcolm slowly lift his eyes toward Elijah in disbelief. "Your father warned me this day would come. Your father warned me this day would come." Ruth Brooks's trembling voice stayed trapped inside the tiny leaking house while rain hammered the roof above them. Elijah stared at her in shock. "Mama, what does that mean?" Ruth looked away immediately. Fear filled her tired eyes. Malcolm Reed slowly lifted the torn land document from the table again. His fingers stopped on one faded signature near the bottom. Brooks Holdings. Elijah noticed his expression change instantly. "You know this name," Malcolm said quietly. Ruth's breathing grew uneven. Too many people died protecting that name. Silence swallowed the room. Outside, the landlord finally walked away muttering threats into the storm. Inside, unpaid bills still covered the kitchen table beside empty medicine bottles and broken family photographs. Malcolm glanced slowly around the collapsing house. Water dripped into metal bowls from holes in the ceiling. The couch springs showed through torn fabric. Elijah's work boots sat drying beside a weak heater that barely functioned. This was the life the village mocked every day. Poverty. Exhaustion. Survival. But Malcolm's eyes kept returning to the old photograph on the wall. Elijah noticed it. "Why do you keep looking at that picture?" Malcolm hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and quietly texted someone. "I need old records from Brooks Holdings. Especially ownership files from 25 years ago." Elijah frowned immediately. "Why are you investigating my family?" Malcolm answered without emotion. "Because too many things do not match." Tiny hope moved through the room again. Dangerous hope. Ruth suddenly grabbed Elijah's wrist tightly. Do not trust rich people too quickly, she whispered weakly. Malcolm heard her clearly but did not react. Instead, he crouched beside the old shelf near the kitchen wall. His eyes stopped on a small wooden box hidden behind folded blankets. What is inside? Elijah froze. Ruth looked terrified instantly. Nothing important. But Malcolm had already noticed the silver symbol carved into the box. The same symbol stamped onto his business card. Emotional silence crashed into the room again. Elijah slowly opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside rested old hospital papers, a faded baby bracelet, and a yellowed envelope sealed for years. Elijah stared at the bracelet. Baby Elijah Brooks. Malcolm looked at the hospital logo and stood immediately. This hospital closed 22 years ago. Ruth whispered painfully, it was not supposed to. Sharp tension filled the tiny house. Malcolm called his assistant again. Find out who shut that hospital down. Elijah looked completely lost now. I do not understand any of this. Malcolm studied him carefully. Neither do I. Yet. Then another emotional spike hit. Ruth suddenly coughed violently into the towel again. Blood did not appear. But the sound alone terrified Elijah. He rushed beside her immediately. You need the doctor tonight. Ruth shook her head weakly. We cannot pay any more. Elijah's face broke silently. The real burden returned instantly. Medicine. Rent. Hunger. Survival. Mystery could wait. Poverty could not. Malcolm quietly placed cash beside the prescription bottles. Elijah noticed immediately and pushed it back. I do not want charity. Malcolm looked directly into his eyes. Good. Because this is not charity. Before Elijah could respond, headlights suddenly swept across the broken windows outside. A black pickup truck stopped near the house. Elijah stiffened immediately. Harold Carter stepped out beneath the rain holding an umbrella while another man waited beside the truck. Malcolm's expression darkened instantly. Interesting timing. Harold knocked hard against the door before entering without invitation. His expensive coat looked almost unnatural inside the tiny ruined house. I came to check on Ruth, Harold announced calmly. Nobody believed him. His eyes moved directly toward the wooden box on the table. Too quickly. Too nervously. Malcolm noticed. Elijah noticed. Ruth noticed most of all. You should leave, Elijah said quietly. Harold ignored him completely. Mr. Reed, he said smoothly, poor people often invent stories when money appears. Malcolm answered coldly. And rich people often bury them. Silence. Sharp. Dangerous. Harold smiled tightly but his jaw clenched hard. This family has nothing connected to Brooks Holdings. Then Ruth suddenly whispered something so soft that only Malcolm fully heard it. That is not what your brother said the night Elijah was born. Malcolm's eyes snapped toward Harold instantly. Harold went pale for the first time all night. Then his phone suddenly rang. He stepped outside quickly to answer. But through the cracked doorway, Elijah overheard one sentence that froze his blood cold. Find the missing hospital file before Reed gets it. Malcolm slowly turned back toward Elijah. His voice lowered completely now. Your family is hiding inside something much bigger than poverty. Then his assistant called back through speakerphone. Sir, the assistant said nervously, we found an old employee file from Brooks Holdings. Malcolm's face hardened instantly. Whose name is on it? Silence crackled through the phone for one heavy second. Then the assistant answered with a name that made Ruth start crying immediately. Daniel Brooks. Daniel Brooks. The name echoed through the tiny leaking house while Ruth Brooks covered her mouth and began crying silently beside the kitchen table. Elijah stared at Malcolm Reed in confusion. That was my father. Malcolm's face remained controlled, but his eyes sharpened instantly. Then somebody lied to you for 25 years. Outside, rain still crashed against broken windows while Harold Carter stood beside his truck pretending not to listen. But Elijah noticed the fear in Harold's face now. Real fear. Malcolm folded the torn land document carefully. I need to verify everything before I say more. Harold stepped back inside immediately. There is nothing to verify, he snapped. Daniel Brooks was a drunk who abandoned his family. Ruth suddenly slammed her weak hand against the table. That is a lie. The room froze. Elijah had never heard his mother raise her voice like that before. Harold's jaw tightened hard. Careful, Ruth. Malcolm slowly looked between them. Tiny suspicion became something heavier now. Dangerous. Then another knock exploded at the door. This time it was not the landlord. Two men in dark jackets stood outside holding papers. Elijah Brooks, one asked coldly. You missed 3 loan payments. This property is under seizure review. Elijah's face dropped instantly. Another humiliation. Another disaster. The men looked past him into the tiny house with visible disgust. Torn furniture. Empty medicine bottles. Ruth coughing beside cracked walls. Poverty displayed like a public punishment. Harold watched silently from the corner. Almost satisfied. Please, Elijah whispered. My mother is sick. One collector shrugged. That is not our problem. Malcolm stepped forward slightly. Who sent you here tonight? The men hesitated immediately after noticing Malcolm's expensive watch and tailored coat. One answered nervously, the debt office received anonymous pressure to accelerate collection. Malcolm's eyes moved slowly toward Harold. Silence. Sharp. Heavy. Harold forced a smile. You cannot blame me for a poor man's debts. Elijah lowered his head in shame while the collectors walked through the house writing notes beside peeling walls and damaged furniture. One even photographed Ruth sitting beneath leaking water. Social humiliation all over again. Ruth wiped tears quietly while trying to straighten her old blanket with dignity. Elijah looked completely broken now. I am trying, he whispered. Every day I am trying. Malcolm noticed the exhaustion in his voice immediately. Not weakness. Survival. Then one collector suddenly spotted the wooden box still open on the table. What is that? Harold reacted too quickly. Nothing important. Malcolm noticed again. So did Elijah. The collector reached toward the old envelope inside the box, but Harold stepped forward sharply. Leave family trash alone. Tiny hope flickered in Malcolm's eyes now. Harold was protecting something. Too aggressively. Elijah finally understood that much. Malcolm quietly pulled his assistant aside near the doorway. Run Daniel Brooks's records again, he ordered softly. And find out why Harold Carter keeps reacting to that box. Harold overheard enough to pale slightly. But he recovered fast. Mr. Reed, he said loudly, you are allowing a desperate family to manipulate you. Elijah clenched his fists. We never asked for any of this. Harold smirked coldly. Poor people always say that before asking for money. Emotional silence crushed the room again. Even the debt collectors avoided eye contact after that. Then tiny hope appeared from somewhere unexpected. One of the collectors quietly slipped Elijah a folded paper before leaving. The hospital file you need, he whispered under his breath. Basement archive room. Elijah blinked in shock. Malcolm noticed instantly. But before Elijah could open the paper, Harold suddenly grabbed his arm hard. You need to stop digging before you destroy your mother completely. Elijah pulled away immediately. Why are you afraid? Harold's face darkened. Because poor men chasing power always end badly. Then obstacle hit again. Ruth collapsed into another violent coughing fit beside the table. Elijah rushed toward her instantly while the debt collectors walked outside shaking their heads. "Hospital now," Malcolm ordered calmly. "I will cover it." Elijah hesitated again. Pride. Shame. Fear. Harold stepped toward the door slowly. "Careful accepting help from rich men, Elijah," he warned quietly. "Sometimes they only help because they already know who they are stealing from." Then Harold left into the storm. Malcolm's expression hardened instantly after hearing that sentence. A slip. A dangerous slip. He already knows who Elijah is. Elijah slowly unfolded the small paper left by the collector. Basement archive room. St. Grace Hospital. But written underneath in rushed handwriting were words that made Malcolm go completely silent. Original birth record removed by H. Carter. Original birth record removed by H. Carter. The sentence stayed frozen in Elijah's trembling hands while rain battered the broken windows behind him. Malcolm Reed slowly took the folded paper and read it again in complete silence. Ruth Brooks looked terrified now. "Burn that," she whispered weakly. "Before somebody sees it." But Malcolm did not burn it. He stared at Harold Carter's truck disappearing into the storm outside and quietly said, "Now I know he is hiding something." Elijah looked exhausted more than hopeful. "What does any of this even mean?" Malcolm answered carefully. "It means your father's name was erased on purpose." Emotional silence swallowed the tiny house again. Then Malcolm's phone rang sharply. His assistant's voice came through immediately. "Sir, St. Grace Hospital basement archives still exist. Most records were destroyed. But security cameras show someone entered the archive room tonight." Malcolm's eyes darkened instantly. "Who?" A pause. "Harold Carter." Elijah froze completely. Ruth lowered her face into her hands and began crying quietly again. First evidence. Real evidence. Not rumor. Not pity. Malcolm grabbed his coat immediately. "We leave now." Elijah hesitated beside his coughing mother. "I cannot leave her alone." Malcolm turned toward the driver waiting outside. "Stay here and get Mrs. Brooks to the clinic safely." Elijah looked shocked. Nobody powerful had ever protected his family before. Tiny hope appeared again. Small. Fragile. Dangerous. 30 minutes later, Malcolm and Elijah stood inside the abandoned St. Grace Hospital basement beneath flickering lights and thick dust. Rusted cabinets lined the walls. Water dripped through old pipes. The air smelled forgotten. Malcolm's expensive shoes moved carefully across broken tiles while Elijah held a flashlight with trembling hands. The contrast between them felt impossible. One man carried wealth, authority, polished confidence. The other carried exhaustion, cracked boots, and years of humiliation. Yet both now searched for the same truth. "Over here," Malcolm said suddenly. One archive drawer hung partially open. Inside rested shredded files scattered across the floor. Elijah crouched slowly beside them. Then his breathing stopped. A faded hospital photograph slipped from between the papers. A newborn baby wrapped in blue cloth. Beside the baby stood Ruth Brooks. And beside Ruth stood a younger Daniel Brooks wearing the exact same silver pocket watch now hanging around Elijah's neck. Malcolm took the photograph slowly. "This proves your father was here the night you were born." Elijah whispered painfully, "Then why erase him?" Before Malcolm could answer, another paper fell from the torn folder onto the ground. Malcolm picked it up carefully. His expression changed instantly. Elijah noticed. "What is it?" Malcolm looked directly at him. "Your birth certificate." Silence crashed through the basement. Elijah's hands shook harder now. Malcolm slowly read aloud. Child name, Elijah Daniel Brooks. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed sharply. Father, emotional silence swallowed the room before he finished the sentence. Elijah's voice cracked. What? Malcolm looked stunned for the first time. This certificate lists your father as Daniel Brooks. He turned the paper over slowly. But the official seal belongs to Brooks Holdings Family Registry. Elijah frowned in confusion. What does that mean? Malcolm stared at the document again. It means your birth was connected to the founding family itself. If you are listening right now, tell me what you think Harold Carter is truly hiding, and why Elijah's birth record terrified him so much. Then obstacle hit instantly. Heavy footsteps echoed above them. Malcolm shut off the flashlight immediately. Voices approached through the basement stairwell. Search every room, a man barked. Mr. Carter wants every document destroyed. Elijah's chest tightened. Harold knew. He knew they found evidence. Malcolm grabbed the birth certificate and photograph quickly. Move. They slipped behind old storage shelves while flashlights swept across the basement. One worker stopped near the open drawer. Looks like somebody already got here first. Another voice answered nervously, then Carter will kill us. Malcolm's eyes sharpened instantly after hearing that sentence. More truth. More fear. But still incomplete. The workers finally moved deeper into the archives. Elijah whispered, "Why would Harold destroy records about my birth?" Malcolm answered softly, "Because your existence threatens something valuable." Then another emotional spike hit. Malcolm unfolded the back side of the birth certificate beneath the flashlight glow. Additional handwriting appeared there. Old. Rushed. Hidden for decades. Elijah stared at the words silently while his entire world began shifting beneath him. Property successor, Brooks family claim pending confirmation. Suddenly Malcolm's phone vibrated again. His assistant sounded panicked now. "Sir. Harold Carter just arrived at Ruth Brooks's clinic." Malcolm's expression hardened instantly. "Protect Elijah," he ordered coldly into the phone. Then he looked directly at Elijah and gripped the old pocket watch tightly in his hand. "This is no longer about poverty," Malcolm whispered. "Somebody has been trying to erase your family for years. Somebody has been trying to erase your family for years." Malcolm Reed's voice stayed low inside the abandoned hospital basement while he held Elijah's birth certificate beneath the weak flashlight glow. Elijah stared at the paper with trembling hands. Property successor, Brooks family claim pending confirmation. The words felt impossible beside his worn jacket, cracked phone, and empty pockets. "I do not want any property," Elijah whispered painfully. "I just want my mother safe." Malcolm looked at him carefully then. Truly carefully for the first time. Not like a poor villager. Not like a burden. Like someone carrying pain far too heavy alone. Upstairs, footsteps still echoed through the hospital while Harold Carter's men searched room after room. Malcolm quietly folded the birth certificate and slipped it into his coat. "Then we protect your mother first. Tiny rescue. Small. Controlled. But real." Elijah followed Malcolm through a dark service hallway leading toward the rear exit. Rain poured outside beneath flickering parking lot lights. Malcolm opened the SUV door himself this time. "Get in." Elijah hesitated beside the luxury vehicle. "I cannot afford this kind of help." Malcolm answered calmly, "Neither could your father when he trusted the wrong people." Silence hit Elijah hard after that sentence. The SUV moved through empty roads while city lights reflected across rain-covered windows. Elijah sat stiffly against expensive leather seats holding the silver pocket watch tightly in his hands. Across from him, Malcolm quietly reviewed the old photograph again. Daniel Brooks. Ruth Brooks. Baby Elijah. Harold Carter standing behind them. Something about Harold's expression bothered him deeply now. "Did my father know yours?" Elijah asked suddenly. Malcolm paused. I think they were connected through Brooks Holdings. Elijah laughed bitterly under his breath. Then why did we end up starving while everybody else got rich? Malcolm did not answer immediately. Because he had started asking himself the same question. They arrived at a small private clinic outside the village where Malcolm's assistant waited near the entrance. Inside, soft white lights replaced leaking roofs and broken walls. Nurses moved quietly through clean hallways. Elijah looked uncomfortable immediately. Too clean. Too expensive. Too far from his real life. Ruth rested inside a warm hospital room now, breathing easier beside fresh medicine and working machines. Elijah froze at the doorway, seeing her safe. Emotional silence filled his chest instantly. Malcolm remained near the door, watching him carefully. Elijah slowly sat beside his mother's bed. You are warm, he whispered softly. Ruth smiled weakly. Nobody has treated me this kindly in years. Malcolm quietly placed the silver pocket watch beside the bed table instead of keeping it himself. Respect. Careful respect. Ruth noticed. So did Elijah. Tiny emotional bond. Then another spike hit. Ruth slowly touched the watch chain and whispered, Daniel used to say Elijah would return home one day. Malcolm's expression changed instantly. Return home? Ruth looked confused after saying it aloud. I should not have said that. Malcolm stepped closer carefully. Mrs. Brooks, what home? Before she could answer, the clinic television suddenly flashed breaking news from the village festival. Vanessa Carter appeared on screen beside Harold. Certain people are spreading lies about my family for money, Vanessa announced publicly. Elijah's face tightened painfully. More humiliation. More public shame. Harold added coldly, poor men become dangerous when they believe they deserve what belongs to others. Elijah lowered his eyes immediately. Even now the village still saw him as desperate trash chasing wealth. Malcolm turned the television off instantly. You do not deserve this. Elijah looked shocked hearing those words from someone powerful. You barely know me. Malcolm answered quietly, I know humiliation when I see it. Silence again. Softer this time. Human. Then a nurse entered holding Elijah's old jacket. This fell from the hospital basement, she said gently. As Elijah took it back, the sleeve shifted slightly, revealing a small birthmark near his wrist. Malcolm froze instantly, staring at it. The exact same crescent-shaped mark appeared in the old photograph on baby Elijah's arm. Malcolm slowly sat down now. Deeply shaken. My God. He whispered under his breath. Elijah frowned immediately. What? Malcolm looked away before answering. Nothing yet. But his eyes said otherwise. Then obstacle struck again. Malcolm's assistant rushed into the room holding a phone. Sir. Harold Carter just sent legal orders demanding Elijah surrender every document connected to Brooks Holdings. Ruth grabbed Elijah's hand instantly in fear. And before anybody could speak again, the clinic hallway phone began ringing loudly at the nurse's station. One nurse answered, then slowly turned pale. There is a man on the line, she whispered nervously toward Malcolm. He says, he knows what happened the night Elijah was born. The nurse slowly lowered the phone with shaking fingers. Rain tapped softly against the clinic windows while everybody inside the room stood frozen. Malcolm Reed took the receiver carefully. Who is this? Silence breathed through the line first. Then an old man answered weakly. I worked at Brooks Mansion 25 years ago. Malcolm's eyes narrowed immediately. What happened the night Elijah was born? Another pause. Fear. Real fear. A child was hidden, the old man whispered. And a woman was thrown out into the storm. Elijah felt his chest tighten instantly beside his mother's bed. Ruth closed her eyes in pain. Old wounds reopening. Malcolm spoke calmly again. Tell me the name. But the lines suddenly crackled. The man lowered his voice even more. Harold Carter did not act alone. Then the call disconnected. Silence swallowed the clinic room. Elijah looked completely lost now. What does that mean? Malcolm slowly lowered the phone. His controlled expression almost cracked for the first time. It means somebody powerful buried your family before you were old enough to speak. Emotional spike. Ruth turned her face away quietly as tears rolled down her cheeks. I tried to protect him, she whispered painfully. I thought disappearing would keep him alive. Malcolm sat beside her carefully now. Who forced you out of Brooks' mansion? Ruth's hands trembled against the blanket. A woman. Another silence hit the room. She said the family would never accept a poor servant carrying Daniel Brooks' child. Elijah's breathing stopped for a second. Daniel Brooks was my father. Ruth could not answer immediately. Too much shame. Too much buried fear. Finally she nodded once. Small. Broken. He promised he would return before sunrise, she whispered. But somebody reached him first. Malcolm looked back at the old photograph now. Daniel Brooks smiling beside Ruth. Harold Carter standing near the staircase in the background. Watching. Always watching. Somebody erased her from every family record, Malcolm murmured quietly. That required help from inside the mansion. Tiny hope rose for Elijah then. Not because he suddenly became rich. Not because life became easy. But because for the first time in years, somebody believed his mother was telling the truth. Elijah looked at Malcolm carefully. So I am not crazy. Malcolm answered softly, no. You were lied to. Emotional contrast filled the room. Warm hospital lights. Old tears. Expensive watches. A poor son sitting beside a sick mother who once cleaned rich floors while carrying a hidden child. Then obstacle struck again. Malcolm's assistant entered quickly holding a brown archive envelope. Sir, we found another hospital file connected to Ruth Brooks. Malcolm opened it immediately. Missing signatures. Altered birth records. A blank father section covered by newer ink. Somebody changed this file after the delivery, Malcolm said sharply. Ruth suddenly became pale staring at the paper. No, she whispered. That handwriting, Elijah looked frightened now. Whose is it? Before Ruth could answer, the clinic hallway door opened hard. Vanessa Carter stepped inside wearing a cream-colored designer coat, guarded by two security men. Cold. Elegant. Furious. Enough lies for one night, she announced sharply. Elijah stood immediately in front of his mother's bed protectively. Vanessa's eyes moved straight toward the archive file in Malcolm's hands. Fear flashed across her face for half a second before disappearing again. Malcolm noticed. So did Elijah. You should not be here, Malcolm said coldly. Vanessa forced a smile. I came to protect this family from manipulation. Ruth suddenly started shaking violently. She knows, Ruth whispered weakly. She was there that night. Silence exploded across the room. Vanessa stepped forward instantly. That woman is confused and sick. Elijah's voice finally hardened. Then why are you afraid? Another emotional spike. Vanessa's expression cracked for one dangerous second. Malcolm slowly placed the altered hospital file beside the silver pocket watch on the table. Two connected clues. Two buried secrets. Mrs. Carter, Malcolm asked quietly, why was Elijah's last name changed 3 days after his birth? Vanessa did not answer immediately. Her silence became louder than any denial. Tiny hope rose again in Elijah's eyes. Then obstacle returned harder. Malcolm's assistant received another urgent message through his phone. Sir. Brooks Mansion archives were cleared out tonight. Entire boxes disappeared. Vanessa turned toward the window instantly. Too quickly. Suspiciously quickly. Malcolm saw it. Elijah saw it too. The room suddenly felt smaller now. Darker. More dangerous. Ruth slowly grabbed Elijah's hand with trembling fingers. Do not trust her, she whispered painfully before looking directly at Malcolm. The person who destroyed our lives, still lives inside Brooks Mansion. Vanessa Carter did not sleep that night. Inside the dark upper floor of Brooks Mansion, she stood beside the fireplace gripping her wine glass too tightly while rain rolled against the giant windows. Her elegant mask was slipping now. Find the nurse, she ordered coldly into the phone. And destroy every remaining file connected to Ruth Brooks. Downstairs, wealthy guests prepared for the annual Brooks Family Foundation banquet. Expensive dresses. Crystal lights. Smiles hiding poison. Vanessa slowly looked toward the grand staircase. Tomorrow ends this, she whispered to herself. Emotional spike. Across town, Elijah sat beside his mother's hospital bed wearing the same worn jacket from the village ceremony. Ruth's breathing sounded weaker tonight. Malcolm Reed stood near the window quietly holding the altered birth file and the silver pocket watch. Somebody inside this family erased your name, he said carefully. Elijah lowered his eyes. Then why invite me to the mansion tomorrow? Malcolm answered calmly. Because traps reveal desperate people. Silence filled the room again. Ruth suddenly grabbed Elijah's wrist tightly. Do not go alone. Elijah forced a weak smile. If I run now, they win forever. Tiny hope flickered in Malcolm's eyes. This poor young man still carried dignity even after humiliation after humiliation. But danger was growing fast now. The next evening, Brooks Mansion glittered under gold lights and luxury cars. Rich guests whispered before Elijah even entered the hall. Phones already rising. Judgment already waiting. Elijah walked carefully beside Malcolm through the massive ballroom. His old shoes against polished marble floors. Hundreds of wealthy eyes watching him like he did not belong there. Vanessa smiled the moment she saw him. Too calm. Too prepared. Interesting, she announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The boy from the village finally found his way into rich company. Small laughter spread through the crowd immediately. Elijah stayed silent. Malcolm noticed security guards quietly surrounding the exits. A trap. Vanessa stepped closer holding a thick folder. Before tonight continues, she declared dramatically, everybody deserves to know the truth about this young man. Emotional spike. Ruth had been brought into the ballroom in a wheelchair beside a private nurse. Her trembling hands tightened instantly. Please, she whispered weakly. Vanessa opened the folder slowly. This boy and his mother have spent weeks manipulating the Brooks family with false inheritance claims. Gasps spread across the room. Guests whispered harder now. Fraud. Scammers. Poor people always want money. Elijah's face tightened painfully. That is not true. Vanessa raised her voice sharply. Then explain why hospital files disappeared after Malcolm Reed started meeting you. Another silence. Another trap tightening. Malcolm narrowed his eyes immediately. The accusation came too fast. Too rehearsed. Vanessa continued coldly. Security footage also shows somebody entering Brooks' archives the night records vanished. She snapped her fingers. A large screen lit up across the ballroom wall. Grainy camera footage appeared. A hooded figure entering the archive room. Gasps filled the hall instantly. Then the figure lowered his hood slightly. Elijah. Or somebody dressed like him. Ruth broke into tears immediately. No, no, guests began turning fully against Elijah now. Phones lifted higher. Social pressure exploded across the ballroom. He lied. He planned everything. Throw him out. Elijah stared at the screen in disbelief. I never went there. Vanessa stepped closer softly. Then why does the camera show your face? Tiny hope appeared for 1 second when Malcolm quietly asked, why is the timestamp missing? Vanessa froze almost invisibly. Just 1 second. But Malcolm saw it. Elijah saw it too. You are protecting him because you pity him, Vanessa snapped quickly. Do not let emotions blind you. Emotional spike again. Ruth suddenly tried to stand from the wheelchair. She is lying, she cried weakly. But the crowd barely listened now. Wealth always sounded more believable than pain. Then another obstacle crashed down. One of the mansion lawyers stepped forward holding another document. There is also witness testimony claiming Elijah threatened archive staff. Elijah looked horrified. I never threatened anybody. Vanessa lowered her voice dramatically. Confess quietly and leave this mansion with dignity. Elijah's eyes filled with tears now. Not for himself. For his mother sitting there shaking in front of everybody again. How many times must poor people beg before somebody hears the truth, he whispered painfully. Silence touched the room for half a breath. Then the crowd turned colder again. Vanessa smiled slightly. She believed she had won. But near the back entrance, a small figure suddenly appeared holding something tightly against his chest. Little Micah. Ruth's neighbor's grandson. The same child who once helped Elijah carry medicine home. His tiny hands trembled around a second flash drive. Malcolm noticed instantly. So did Vanessa. Fear exploded across her face for the first time. Micah looked directly toward Malcolm and shouted with a shaking voice, I found the real camera copy. The ballroom froze. At that exact moment, the giant mansion doors slowly opened again, and Malcolm Reed stepped fully into the center of the hall holding another sealed evidence envelope nobody had seen before. The giant mansion doors closed slowly behind Malcolm Reed as the ballroom fell into complete silence. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of wealthy guests frozen between fear and curiosity. Little Micah stood near the entrance clutching the second flash drive tightly against his chest while security guards exchanged nervous looks. Vanessa Carter forced another smile, but her hands were trembling now. This is becoming ridiculous, she snapped sharply. A child with a flash drive does not erase fraud. Malcolm walked calmly toward the center stage without answering immediately. Quiet authority filled the room instantly. Elijah stood beside his mother's wheelchair, exhausted and humiliated again, but still refusing to lower his head. Ruth gripped his hand tightly as whispers rolled through the ballroom like poison. Poor people always create drama. Maybe the boy really lied. Why would Vanessa Carter fake this? Emotional spike. Malcolm slowly placed the sealed envelope beside the silver pocket watch and the altered hospital file already sitting on the long banquet table. 3 pieces. 3 buried truths waiting to collide. Vanessa noticed the watch immediately and her expression tightened again. You should stop this before you embarrass yourself, she warned coldly. Malcolm finally looked directly at her. Interesting choice of words. Silence spread wider now. Elijah's breathing remained uneven. He still looked like an outsider among diamonds, tailored suits, and luxury gowns. His worn jacket. His tired eyes. His mother's weak body beside him. Yet for the first time, some guests were no longer laughing. Tiny Hope had entered the room quietly. Micah slowly walked toward Malcolm holding the flash drive with shaking fingers. I copied it before they deleted everything, the boy whispered nervously. Vanessa stepped forward instantly. That child was manipulated. Ruth suddenly cried out, leave him alone. Emotional spike again. The entire ballroom turned toward her trembling voice. Malcolm gently accepted the flash drive and handed it to his assistant. "Prepare the screen," he ordered calmly. Vanessa's confidence cracked for half a second. "You cannot trust stolen files." Malcolm answered softly, "Then you should not fear them." Public silence hit harder now. Even the musicians in the corner stopped moving. Guests lowered their champagne glasses slowly. Somebody near the back whispered, "Why does she look so scared?" Elijah noticed Vanessa glance toward the side exit again. Too quickly. Too often. Another clue. Another fracture in her control. Malcolm stepped toward Elijah now. "You will stay here," he said quietly. "Nobody will remove you from this room tonight." Elijah looked stunned for a second. Nobody powerful had ever protected him publicly before. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered painfully. Malcolm paused before answering. "Because lies survive when decent people stay silent." Emotional contrast filled the ballroom instantly. Rich marble floors. Gold lights. Security guards. Cameras. And a poor young man finally being allowed to stand still instead of being thrown out. Around 60% into the tension, the narrator feeling naturally pulled the audience deeper. If you were standing in that ballroom, who would you believe right now? The rich woman with power, or the poor boy risking everything to protect his mother? Vanessa suddenly clapped her hands sharply to reclaim the room. "Enough emotion," she announced loudly. "This family owes nobody explanations." Then she pointed directly at Elijah. "That boy came here for money." Gasps spread again. Another obstacle. Another attempt to turn the crowd. Elijah's eyes filled with tears but his voice stayed low. "I came because my mother spent 25 years crying over a truth nobody wanted to hear." Silence. Raw silence. One elderly guest slowly lowered her phone. Another guest stopped whispering entirely. Tiny hope grew stronger. Then Vanessa moved again quickly. "Play the footage," she demanded aggressively. "Everybody deserves to see who entered the archives." Malcolm raised one hand calmly. "We will." His calmness frightened her more than anger would have. The assistant connected the flash drive slowly while the giant ballroom screen remained black for a few painful seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed normally anymore. Ruth quietly began crying again beside Elijah. "I never wanted this life for you," she whispered weakly. Elijah knelt beside her wheelchair. "Then why did you keep the watch all these years?" Ruth looked toward Malcolm instead of answering. Another mystery. Another silence. Then Micah suddenly spoke again with trembling courage. There was another name on the file. Vanessa turned toward him instantly. Pure panic crossed her face. Malcolm noticed everything now. Every breath. Every crack. Every lie. Emotional spike. A mansion servant slowly approached Malcolm carrying one final document recovered from the burned archive boxes. The edges were blackened by smoke. Vanessa stepped backward slightly. Malcolm opened the folder halfway, then stopped. His eyes darkened immediately. "Interesting," he murmured quietly. He looked toward Vanessa with controlled intensity. "You knew about this child from the beginning." The ballroom froze completely. Vanessa's lips parted but no words came out. Malcolm slowly picked up the microphone while the giant screen behind him flickered to life. Ruth closed her eyes. Elijah gripped the edge of the wheelchair. Micah held his breath. And Malcolm Reed finally spoke the words that made the entire ballroom fall silent. "Before you judge her, watch this." The giant ballroom screen flickered once. Then the real archive footage finally began to play. Complete silence swallowed Brooks' mansion. No music. No whispers. Only the sound of the old camera recording crackling through the speakers. The video showed the archive hallway from 3 nights earlier. Vanessa Carter appeared first. Clear. Unmistakable. Elegant cream coat. Same pearls. Same face. Gasps spread immediately across the ballroom. Vanessa's lips parted. This footage is edited. Malcolm Reed did not even look at her. Watch carefully. Emotional spike. The footage continued. Vanessa unlocked the archive room herself. Then another figure entered carrying boxes filled with hospital files. One security guard beside the screen whispered softly, "She ordered us to clear the room that night." Phones slowly lowered across the ballroom now. Guests stopped recording. Stopped smiling. Stopped breathing comfortably. Elijah stood frozen beside Ruth's wheelchair. His tired eyes remained locked on the screen while his mother quietly cried beside him. Then the second layer of truth arrived. The recovered hospital document appeared on screen beside the camera footage. Malcolm opened the final burned file carefully in front of everybody. Ruth Brooks gave birth to a son 25 years ago, he announced calmly. The father listed in the original file was Daniel Brooks. Complete silence exploded through the mansion. Somebody dropped a champagne glass. Vanessa stepped backward instantly. No, Malcolm raised the altered document beside the original version. The father's name was later removed. Another emotional spike hit harder. Ruth covered her mouth while tears rolled down her face uncontrollably. Elijah looked like the ground beneath him had disappeared. My entire life, he whispered painfully. My entire life was a lie. Vanessa immediately pointed toward Ruth desperately. She trapped Daniel. She wanted money. But before her words could spread, Micah stepped forward with trembling courage. That is not true, the child said softly. He handed Malcolm another folded paper recovered from the archive boxes. Malcolm unfolded it slowly. A handwritten letter. Daniel Brooks' signature at the bottom. Malcolm read carefully. If anything happens to Ruth or my child before I return, know that I never abandoned them willingly. Public silence crushed the ballroom now. Wealthy guests who once laughed at Elijah suddenly looked ashamed to even raise their eyes. The third reveal came quietly. Ruth reached weakly into her coat pocket and pulled out the old silver pocket watch. Malcolm opened it before everybody. Inside was a hidden photograph. Young Daniel Brooks smiling beside pregnant Ruth under an oak tree near Brooks' mansion. The exact same watch visible in Daniel's hand from an old family portrait displayed upstairs. One elderly woman from the Brooks family gasped loudly. That was Daniel's engagement watch. Vanessa's composure shattered further. This proves nothing. Malcolm turned toward her for the first time fully. Calm. Sharp. Dangerous. Then explain why you personally ordered the birth records altered 3 days after Daniel Brooks died. Vanessa froze completely. The ballroom turned toward her instantly. Emotional spike. Ruth finally whispered the truth that had destroyed her life for 25 years. She told me poor women do not belong in powerful families. Tears rolled harder down Elijah's face now. Not from shame anymore. From understanding. From finally seeing why every door had closed against him his entire life. Malcolm spoke again. Daniel Brooks never abandoned Ruth or his son. Somebody erased them after his death. Public reaction shifted violently now. Rich guests who once mocked Elijah stared at him with shock. Some lowered their heads. Some stepped away from Vanessa entirely. One board member whispered, "My God, he is Daniel's heir." Vanessa tried one final time to regain control. This boy has no proof he belongs to this family. Malcolm calmly lifted the final page from the burned archive file. DNA authorization record signed secretly years ago by Daniel himself before his death. He already knew, Malcolm said quietly. Daniel Brooks knew Elijah was his son. Silence hit harder than thunder. Elijah could barely stand now. Ruth sobbed quietly beside him. Vanessa's face lost all color. Then the final blow arrived. Malcolm placed the documents directly in front of her. You hid a child from his father's family. Another silence. Brutal. Heavy. Then Malcolm asked the one question Vanessa Carter could not answer anymore. How many lives did you destroy to protect your position in this mansion? Vanessa Carter stood frozen beneath the crystal chandelier while every eye inside Brooks' mansion burned into her face. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody defended her anymore. Malcolm Reed's final question still hung in the ballroom like thunder. How many lives did you destroy to protect your position in this mansion? Vanessa's lips trembled slightly. Then she laughed weakly. Forced. Hollow. You are all making a mistake. But even her own voice no longer sounded powerful. Ruth Brooks slowly looked up from her wheelchair, tears still running silently down her cheeks. 25 years of humiliation sat inside those tears. 25 years of silence. Elijah stood beside her, breathing hard, trying to understand how his entire life had been stolen before he could even speak his first word. Emotional silence swallowed the ballroom again. Then one elderly Brooks family member stepped away from Vanessa first. Others followed quietly. The distance around her grew larger with every second. One woman whispered painfully, "We trusted her." Another shook his head slowly. "She erased Daniel's son." Vanessa pointed desperately toward Ruth. "She came here for money." But this time nobody moved. Nobody nodded. Nobody believed her anymore. Malcolm finally stepped forward fully. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous without raising his voice. The legal department already confirmed the documents. He lifted the original hospital file again. The records were altered under Vanessa Carter's authorization. Public shock spread again through the room. One wealthy guest lowered his phone slowly. Another guest quietly walked away from Vanessa entirely. Emotional spike. Vanessa's mask cracked further. "Daniel is dead," she snapped suddenly. "Nobody can prove what he wanted." That was when Ruth carefully held up the silver watch again. Her hand still trembled. "He gave me this the night he promised to come back for us." Malcolm opened the watch once more in front of everybody. Inside the hidden compartment rested Daniel Brooks' handwritten note beside the old photograph. Same signature. Same handwriting from the archived letter. Same promise. Final proof. Vanessa's face lost all remaining color. Elijah looked at the photograph like a starving man finally seeing light. "He knew about me," he whispered painfully. "He never abandoned us." Ruth closed her eyes and cried harder now. Not from shame anymore. From relief. One of the Brooks board members stood slowly from the dining table. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, effective immediately, "you are removed from all family financial authority pending formal investigation." Gasps spread instantly again. Vanessa stumbled backward. "You cannot do this to me." Malcolm answered quietly. "You already did it to yourself." Emotional spike. The rich guests who once mocked Elijah near the mansion gates now avoided looking directly at him. The same guards who dragged him outside earlier lowered their heads in shame. One even stepped closer carefully. "Sir, we did not know." Elijah said nothing. His silence carried more dignity than revenge ever could. Then Micah walked toward Elijah slowly and held his hand tightly in front of everybody. "I told them you were not lying." That small voice shattered the last wall inside the ballroom. Ruth broke into tears again. Several guests quietly wiped their own eyes. Vanessa looked around desperately for support. Nobody moved. Nobody stood beside her anymore. The camera footage replayed silently across the ballroom screen behind her now like judgment itself. Her lies. Her orders. Her fear. Public truth had already buried her status deeper than any punishment could. Malcolm spoke once more. All evidence will be transferred officially to family attorneys and investigators tonight. Then he turned toward Elijah. For the first time, his voice softened. Your father's name will be restored. Elijah's breathing shook visibly now. His entire life had been spent being called poor, worthless, unwanted. Yet the truth had survived anyway. Ruth reached for her son's hand tightly. I am sorry, she whispered through tears. Elijah knelt beside her wheelchair immediately. You protected me, he answered softly. That was never weakness. Emotional release spread quietly through the room. No applause. No cheering. Just heavy silence and shame hanging over the wealthy family that once ignored them. Malcolm then removed one final envelope from the archive file and placed it gently into Elijah's hands. Official Brooks family documents. Inheritance recognition papers. Daniel Brooks' sealed acknowledgement letter. Elijah stared at them silently, unable to breathe for a moment. Then Malcolm looked directly at him and said the words that changed everything forever. You do not belong outside these gates anymore. The giant mansion doors slowly opened behind them while Ruth cried softly beside her son. Elijah Brooks, Malcolm said quietly, you are finally home. The giant mansion doors remained open behind Elijah Brooks while the cold night air slowly drifted into the ballroom. Nobody moved for several seconds. The words still echoed inside his chest. You are finally home. Elijah stood there holding the old family documents with trembling hands. The same hands that once carried broken delivery boxes. The same hands that begged security guards not to throw him outside the mansion gates. Ruth Brooks quietly reached for his arm. Her breathing was weak, but her eyes looked lighter than they had in years. Malcolm Reed stepped closer carefully. Calm as always. The medical team is already waiting upstairs for your mother, he said softly. Ruth lowered her head immediately, overwhelmed. Nobody has ever helped us like this. Malcolm answered without hesitation. That should have happened a long time ago. Emotional silence filled the hallway again. Then little Micah ran toward Elijah and wrapped his small arms tightly around him. Does this mean we are safe now? Elijah could barely answer. His throat burned with emotion. Yes, he whispered. We are safe now. Tears rolled down Ruth's face again. Not tears of shame anymore. Tears of relief. The mansion staff who once ignored them now stepped aside respectfully as Elijah walked through the hallway for the first time. Slow steps. Careful steps. Like somebody afraid the dream might disappear. The same marble floor that once reflected humiliation now reflected dignity returning quietly to a broken family. Emotional release spread softly through the mansion. Upstairs, doctors checked Ruth carefully in a warm private room instead of the overcrowded public clinic where she had been turned away before. Fresh flowers rested beside the bed. Clean blankets. Warm light. Peace. One doctor smiled gently at Elijah. Your mother will finally receive proper treatment. Elijah closed his eyes for one painful second. He remembered unpaid bills. Rain leaking through the apartment roof. Nights without food. The old hospital that refused to wait any longer. Now everything looked different. Yet the pain of those years still lived inside him. Malcolm later stood beside the large window overlooking the village roads below. Elijah approached slowly. The silver watch rested safely in his hands now. Not as evidence anymore. As family. As truth. Malcolm looked at the watch carefully. Daniel Brooks spoke about his son often before he died. Elijah looked stunned. He knew. Malcolm nodded once. He spent years searching after Vanessa hid the records. Silence again. Heavy silence. Then Malcolm added quietly, your father never rejected you. Elijah finally broke down fully then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quiet tears falling while he held the watch against his chest. Years of humiliation melted inside that moment. One promise survived everything. Emotional spike. The next morning, sunlight entered the mansion differently. Softer. Warmer. Ruth sat near the garden wrapped in a clean blanket while Micah laughed for the first time in days beside the fountain. The sound stopped several workers in silence. Even they smiled softly. Elijah stepped outside wearing clean clothes Malcolm's staff had prepared for him, but he still carried the same humble posture. The pain had not turned him cruel. One older housekeeper approached carefully. Ashamed. I am sorry for how we treated you. Elijah looked at her gently. You believed what you were told. No anger. No revenge. Only dignity. Inside the mansion office, Vanessa Carter's portraits had already been removed quietly from the walls. Her authority was gone. Her lies had collapsed beneath the same truth she tried to bury. Nobody celebrated loudly. The silence itself became her punishment. Malcolm later handed Elijah another folder. Legal inheritance recognition. Educational trust documents for Micah. Ownership papers restoring Daniel Brooks' hidden land rights to Ruth's name. Elijah stared at the papers in disbelief. Why are you helping us? Malcolm answered calmly, because truth deserves protection. Emotional release again. That evening, Elijah returned briefly to the old apartment building one final time. The broken hallway lights still flickered. The landlord who once threatened to throw them outside avoided eye contact completely now. Elijah looked around slowly at the place where his family suffered for years. Then he placed the old photograph of Ruth and Daniel inside a small frame before carrying it away carefully. Not hidden anymore. Not forgotten anymore. As the black luxury car drove back toward Brooks' mansion, Micah leaned against Elijah's shoulder sleepily. Uncle Elijah, he whispered, are we rich now? Elijah smiled quietly through tired eyes. No, he answered softly. We are finally respected. The mansion gates opened slowly again beneath the evening sky. Ruth waited near the doorway with tears of peace in her eyes while Malcolm stood silently nearby like a guardian who had finally corrected an old injustice. Elijah stepped forward carrying the silver watch, the framed photograph, and the papers with his real name. Elijah Brooks. No longer unwanted. No longer poor in the eyes of the world. Just a man who survived long enough for the truth to return. And as the mansion doors closed gently behind them, one lesson remained stronger than money, power, or status. Never mock the poor. Never judge a person by old clothes or trembling hands. Truth may be delayed, but it can never stay buried forever. Those who destroy innocent lives for pride will eventually face shame before the world. And sometimes, the people treated like nothing are the very people fate was preparing to raise all along.